Now, the Chinese have expanded by a factor of 10 economically. They see themselves as a peer power to the Americans, but they are unwilling to admit that all of the growth that they have had, every little scrap of it, is because of the globalized system that the US maintains. And when the Russians fell under sanction, everything that the Chinese thought was true about their future was laid bare as, at best, wishful thinking and bad analysis. So they are now looking east to the United States and west to the Russians in a little bit of a panic because they are being tied indirectly to what's going on in Ukraine. And they have now found out not only does the West's and specifically the United States' financial tools work very well, they now know they would work much better against China than against Russia. Because at its core, Russia is a commodities exporter, most notably oil, natural gas, and food. China imports all those things. So if an equivalent sanctions regime was done against the Chinese, you'd have 500 million dead Chinese in less than a year from starvation. And that assumes nothing else gets folded into the situation. So the Chinese are trying to wrestle with the collapse of 50 years of strategic planning and their core ideology as being completely non-functional. I'd say, if you look at the rhetoric from the last 3 weeks, they're doing a decent job of segueing, but you don't rip the mental roots out of an entire system overnight and expect people to just blink and then all of a sudden be on the new scale. Oh, the Europeans have shown that maybe that is a little bit more possible than I'm saying here. But the Chinese have always seen themselves as anti-American. They've always seen themselves as anti-Western, anti-democracy. And now they're realizing that the mood of the man in the White House determines whether their country exists. They're not going to turn on a dime for that, but we'll know soon. I think this is another one of those things that will be shaken out one way or another by the end of April. One other thing. As tight as the sanctions are and as big as they're getting, they're nothing compared to the corporate boycotts. Almost every single company that left Russia was under no legal requirement to do so. They just didn't want to be associated with the war. And we're talking about those ESG, social goody two-shoes, mammoth companies like Exxon and Halliburton, who are now gone, and everyone else followed. So if that happened to China, that's all of their investment that matters. That's all of their technology transfers. That's all of their end markets. This system, if it turned against China, would be far more damning than anything we've seen out of Russia so far. Sure. Well, let's start with the what works. The blockchain, digital currency, I have no problem with that. I just see that as the next step in how central banks manage their money supply. So it's not like I'm opposed to digital writ large. But Bitcoin, anything that is going to be a currency has to have liquidity, and Bitcoin has no mechanism for expanding what is necessary to match market demands. It is based on how many people can crunch however much data, and then them getting paid for it. But that doesn't actually generate anything of value that is not in Bitcoin already. So there's no issuing mechanism that works. It's not a method of exchange. It's too volatile. There's no one that regulates its supply. There's no one that can make it access this market or that market as legal tender unless you want to be in, is it El Salvador? One of the Central American countries has decided to go that way. Not working out great for them. It's tulip mania without the tulips. It's not an asset. It's not a store of value. It's not a method of exchange. And it's certainly not independent. Because what we saw with the Russian sanctions is all the connections between Bitcoin and the real financial sector got locked. And if you're going for Bitcoin on a libertarian basis, that should disprove that there's any use to it at all. So that's kind of like the big three from my point. See, when you put it that way, it makes it sound like digital gold. And I would also argue that gold is a horrible vehicle for store of value. We've seen that with the Russians. All of their gold is in the country. They can't trade it. It's worth nothing to them now. And so when I see Bitcoin, yes, it's there behind the scenes, but it's their connections to the real financial sector that allow it to be exchanged. And those can be blocked by a central bank without even needing an executive order. So the degree of vulnerability for the asset overall just seems extreme to me. You're basically making the EV argument there. If we rip out the old architecture and put in an architecture that is designed for this new asset, then everything will be fine. Unfortunately, we have to deal with life in between A and B. And the
I agree
only
with that.
people who can say that B is better are the people who are theorizing. There's no example of it. And we'd have to, first break down everything. Well, let me give you a scenario where Bitcoin or things like it might have a role in the future.
Okay.
The whole globalization thread that has driven everything since 1945, that's what's breaking down right now. And in my second book, Absent Superpower, I think one of the things I said is it doesn't really matter where the break happens, it's going to cascade. So the Russia-Ukraine war was one of the specific examples I had. There was one in the Persian Gulf, there's one in East Asia. If you move away from the trade environment that we have, it's not that the dollar standard goes away. It probably becomes more important because the United States will be even more emotionally disconnected from other sections of the world and be more of an impartial arbiter, and the dollar be more important and take more market share. But if you break down into a series of disconnected regional trading networks, not all of them have a country at its core that I would consider an economic power. So when you're looking at certain parts of the world that are going to lack access to and influence over any sort of Federal Reserve action, having another method of exchange that is not the physical US dollar has a role. You'll have to keep the electricity on. You'll have to keep the web working. And some of these places probably aren't going to be able to manage that. But there are other ways to establish a method of exchange in an environment where the US just doesn't care about half the planet. 3 strategies. One of the strategies used to be to find a regional pole like the euro or the yuan to work with. That has becoming less and less popular as people realize just how much the Chinese manipulate the currency, and especially in the aftermath of this round of sanctions against the Russians, even the euro is not seen as a good role for that. So we're left with 2 others. One is amalgamation, where you have a number of countries that pool their financial heft to make a regional currency, like the Caribbean dollar, or West Africa had the West African franc. I can't even honestly remember the status of that right now. It's changed so much in the last 2 years. Or option number 3, you just peg it to the dollar, and that's not just Belize, that's de facto Hong Kong and Taiwan. You find ways to link yourselves into the bond market. So even if the currencies do swing, you have enough exposure so you get brought along for the swing. And that's more or less what the Australians and the Kiwis have been doing for decades. I see a lot more of that moving forward, because the parts of the world that the US is going to remain engaged in are the Western Hemisphere plus Southeast Asia and maybe Western Europe. But if you're talking about the Brits and the Japanese and the US and Canada, that's already 4 members of the G7. And if you include the rest of that kind of inner circle zone, you're still talking about 2 billion people. So either you can be associated with that, countries that have broadly positive demographic growth and consumption-led growth moving forward, or you can tie yourself onto something else where security is going to be a bigger concern for you than the finance. And when that is how people are thinking, that security is more important than finance, I really have a hard time seeing something like Bitcoin coming in out of the shadows. That from a government's point of view, the same things that give that a positive spin and make that useful are so attractive to organized crime.